I'm going to ground us in a practice that the Sierra Club and many other environmental organizations practice, and that is an Indigenous land acknowledgement. And we do this as a way to integrate respect for Indigenous people and recognize their enduring relationships to the land throughout all of our programs. We do this to raise awareness about the important histories that are often suppressed or forgotten, and to ensure that these histories can be remembered, and so that past harms are not continually perpetrated. We do this in a process of knowing and acknowledging the ground beneath our feet are a way of honoring and expressing gratitude for the people on this land before us. It familiarizes visitors with the cultures and the histories of Missouri's Indigenous tribes, as well as with their ties to the land of the state. So we're beginning this night with an acknowledgement that the land on which we are gathering virtually across Missouri is the seized territory of many tribes, including the Kickapoo, Osage, Alini, Saxon Fox, Shawnee, Quapaw, Iowa, and Otoe, Missouri. And then we're going to copy in a link to the chat. So if anyone wants to integrate a practice like this into their own programs, they could do so as well. And so with that, Kane, if you can go into the next slides, we're going to do a brief introductions of some of the folks you are seeing on your screen who are going to be helping facilitate tonight's meeting. And then I guess we can just go down and introduce ourselves one at a time. So Anne, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. I'm Ann Calvert, she, her, from Kansas City, Missouri, League of Women Voters.
Thanks. I'm Ashton. I'm a grassroots organizer. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I'm based in St. Louis City, and I organize our clean energy action in the city of St. Louis County, and help coordinate our statewide democracy program. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Price. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of St. Louis, and I chair their Speakers Bureau. So with that, I will pass it on to Greg.
Good evening, I'm Greg Woodhams. I'm the Voter Education Chair of the League of Women Voters, Kansas City.
Thanks. Us four, and it's along with my colleague King, Executive Director Jean Dugan, President Marilyn McLeod, and Denise, who is going to introduce herself here momentarily, have helped put together this program. And we are the folks who will be helping facilitate the question and answer box. We're going to be helping track time, making sure everything flows smoothly. So if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box, mention our name so we can get your attention. And you will be receiving follow-up information from one of us. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce tonight's presenter and our guru of all things House Bill 1878 at this moment. One of the gurus. There are many gurus, but right now, tonight, our guru is Denise Lieberman, who is the Director and General Counsel of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, a nonpartisan statewide network of advocates who work to protect the right to vote in Missouri. Denise also teaches law and political science at Washington University here in St. Louis, has testified before Congress in support of the Voting Rights Act, and has litigated challenges to voting laws in Missouri, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina, among others. She's a lawyer of a record in 2 lawsuits filed last week on behalf of the League of Women Voters and the NAACP, challenging the provisions of Missouri's House Bill 1878, which we're going to get into here tonight. She has previously served as the National Director of Power and Democracy at Advancement Project National Office, which is a racial justice organization, and as a consultant with the Brennan Center. She is the faculty director of voter access and engagement in the Center for Social Development. So with that, I'm going to spotlight Denise and have her share her screen and take over tonight's program. Thank you so much, Denise. We are so appreciative of you being here.
Thank you so much, Ashton. Thank you to the Missouri Sierra Club. Thank you so much to the League of Women Voters. Thank you to all of you who are here tonight for this important webinar. My name is Denise Lieberman. I'm the Director and General Counsel of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. And we've got a lot to talk about today because earlier this week, a new voting law went into effect in the state of Missouri that will dramatically change not only the way that voters will experience voting this year, but will also affect the work of many civic engagement organizations that work to ensure that our communities and voters have access to the political process. And we're going to cover several key provisions of this new law here tonight. Well, Missouri's new voting law comes into effect midway through this year's 2022 election cycle. And what that means for voters and for advocates alike is that the rules that you experienced when you went to vote in August aren't going to be the same when you go to vote this November. And so we're here to make sure that we all have the tools. We know what the law is. We know where we're going with it, how we can advocate successfully about this law. And we're going to give you some tips tonight on things that you can do to help ensure not only that you can vote, but that all of the groups and communities that you work with will be able to have their voices heard in this year's important elections. I want to invite you all to participate in the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. The groups co-sponsoring here tonight are all members, as are many of you. We are the statewide nonpartisan voter protection table, and we collaborate with one another across organizations, across counties in the state, across jurisdictions in the state, young and old, to help ensure that everybody can vote, because we know that this goal is common to so many of us, so much of the work we do. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition includes about 60 affiliated organizations that include environmental justice organizations, that include civil rights organizations, that include student and youth organizations, that include senior organizations, that include labor organizations, faith organizations, disability rights organizations, English Plus organizations, and many, many more. Please join our efforts to help ensure that all Missourians can cast a ballot this year, especially right now with a new voting law going into effect that's bound to create questions and confusion for Missouri's voters. We need all hands on deck, and we need all of you to step up and help be Missouri. You can join our efforts by texting MOVPC to 66866 or sending us an email at info@movpc.org. And I invite you to join us every Monday on a Zoom call for updates on all things voting rights in Missouri. All right, well, we're here tonight to talk about the new law that was just enacted earlier this week that went into effect on Sunday, August 28th. And this measure really was a top priority of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, and many of our partners during the legislative session ended up passing in the final 24 hours of the legislative session, despite ardent criticism from many elected officials who serve on the House Elections Committee. And while many people understand this new law to be about requiring voter ID to vote, which it does, the truth is this law does so much more. House Bill 1878 started out as a standalone voter ID bill, but at the end of the day ended up including more than 36 provisions that really dramatically changed election and election administration in the state of Missouri. And we're going to talk about several of these measures here today, but I'm more than happy to answer questions about any of the provisions in this new voting law. Today, we are going to cover three that affect the greatest numbers of people and voter advocates in particular. We're going to cover the law's restrictions on voter registration, in particular, the compensation ban, the unpaid solicitor registration requirement, the registered voter requirement. We're also going to talk about the absentee ballot solicitation ban that's in this new law. And don't worry, we will end with a discussion about photo ID and what you can do to help ensure that Missourians have the tools they need to cast a ballot. For each of these provisions, we're going to do three things. We're going to try to answer the question, what is it? What does it do? What does it require? We're going to try and answer why we're challenging those provisions in court, because we are challenging these three provisions in court right now on behalf of the League of Women Voters and the Missouri NAACP. And we're going to include what you can do, because while House Bill 1878 includes many restrictions that undermine our ability to get the word out and undermine the ability of underserved voters to have their voices heard, there are many things that we can do. And indeed, we will have to make sure that people have the tools and the information they need to cast a ballot. And so following up from today's program, everybody who signed up here today is going to get follow-up materials, including a toolkit with some talking points, with information so that you can talk accurately and clearly and help explain this new law to others, and some tools that you can share with the communities you work with. Well, let's start with voter registration. House Bill 1878, voter registration restrictions. Here's the actual language that's in the bill itself. And you can see in red the pieces of the prior law that were removed, and in blue the pieces that have been added. In short, here's what the three things that this requirement does. First, it provides that no one shall be paid or otherwise compensated for soliciting voter registration except for a governmental entity or someone paid by the government. A violation of this compensation provision is a Class 3 election offense, which is a misdemeanor offense. The second is what we call the unpaid solicitor registration requirement. So not only can no one other than the government be paid or otherwise compensated to solicit voter registration, but it also requires any volunteers who expect to solicit 10 or more registrations in an entire election cycle have to register with the Secretary of State's office as a voter registration solicitor. And that is a form that you have to fill out. I'm going to show you the form a little bit later on. It's a form you have to fill out, and it does require an actual signature. And so it's a form that you'll have to print and then get back in to the Secretary of State's office. It is, under the new law, a Class 3 election offense to knowingly fail to register as a solicitor, a misdemeanor election offense. Both of those, if convicted, potentially could result in loss of voting rights as an election offense. And finally, the third requirement for voter registration is that anyone who is a solicitor, in other words, those volunteers that may expect to register 10 or more people, the only people who can be voter registration solicitors are those who are over 18 and have to be registered voters in Missouri. And failure, if if someone who's not registered or not 18 is undertaking this activity, that is a class 4 election offense. And so when we think about these 3 provisions, especially when they're tied together, you can start to see how this may potentially burden voters. If no one can be paid and voter advocates, if no one can be paid or otherwise compensated, well, that could burden voter registration organizations or organizations whose staff do voter registration as some part of their work, because now all voter registration must be done by volunteers. In addition, it will require those volunteers to take a step before they actually go out to register voters by submitting that form to the Secretary of State. And finally, it will limit who can do voter registration only to those who are in fact registered voters in Missouri, excluding people who may be here in the state, maybe out-of-state college students who may be registered in another state, but want to work a voter registration drive on campus. It would exclude young people, high school students who may not be old enough to register to vote themselves, but want to get involved in helping their classmates get engaged in the voter registration process. And we know when young people get involved, it's a very compelling activity that keeps them involved for life. It would exclude returning citizens or people who are on probation and parole or otherwise ineligible to vote, many of whom can also be very persuasive voter registration and civic engagement advocates. So let's break this down. We know there's 3 rules. One of them has to do with compensation. It says no one shall be paid or otherwise compensated for doing voter registration outside of the government. So who can get paid or compensated? Well, a governmental entity can. And so if you work for a governmental entity, or if you interact with a governmental entity, they can still do voter registration just as they did before. In fact, federal law requires many government agencies like social service agencies and motor vehicles offices are required under federal law to provide voter registration. Who cannot get paid or compensated to do voter registration? Well, that would be anyone who's not a governmental entity or not paid by the government. So that would include nonprofits, individuals, private agencies, even private colleges and universities. And what we don't know is what constitutes being paid or otherwise compensated. And that's one confusing aspect of this law. No one can be paid or otherwise compensated for doing voter registration, but the law doesn't define what it means to be otherwise compensated. So we don't know, for example, if that would include reimbursing volunteers for parking or travel or transportation or supplies. We don't know if that would prohibit providing gifts or t-shirts to volunteers, or even providing snacks or water for volunteers. We also don't know, because it's not defined in the law, what constitutes soliciting voter registration. It's not defined anywhere in the statute. Now, the dictionary describes solicitation as making a request, urging or encouraging people to do something. But it's unclear here whether this requirement will apply only to people who are actively assisting a voter with a registration form, or if it would apply more broadly to activities that advocate or encourage people to register to vote, right? Signage that says register to vote, emails that may point people to the Secretary of State's online voter registration portal and urging people to do so might be considered solicitation. We just don't know. And that's one reason why this law is unclear and vague. Finally, who must register as a voter registration solicitor? Again, no one outside of government can be paid or otherwise compensated for soliciting voter registration. And now any volunteer, any unpaid person, or anyone who expects to solicit more than 10 voter registration applications in an election cycle, that's a 2-year period, needs to register with the Secretary of State, and they must be a registered voter in the state of Missouri. And so I'm going to jump right into the absentee voting provisions here too, because they contain some similar language that is also unclear. House Bill 1878, absentee ballot application restrictions, forbid any individual, group, or party from soliciting a voter into obtaining an absentee ballot application. That's the exact language out of the statute. Now, this is a pretty hefty offense. Violating this provision is a Class 1 election offense. That is a potential felony conviction that includes as a penalty possible fine, possible jail time, and permanent loss of voting rights in Missouri for the rest of your life. So that's a pretty serious offense. So again, this provision forbids any individual, group, or party from soliciting a voter into obtaining an absentee ballot application. But again, just like with the voter registration provisions, we don't know what it means to solicit someone into obtaining an absentee ballot application. Is it handing the person an absentee ballot application? Is it waiting for the person to fill out an absentee ballot application? Or is it more broadly encouraging someone to obtain an application for an absentee ballot or providing instructions to them for how they can do so? And we know that here in Missouri, many voters, particularly underserved communities, are elderly, people with disabilities, people who may be homebound, people with chronic health conditions, people who are caregivers for children or elderly relatives, are the folks that need to get those applications the most. People who are not able to get to their polling place on election day. And these are also the same communities that often have the greatest difficulty understanding how to get an absentee ballot. Now, here in Missouri, you do have to apply for an absentee ballot, and the election authority vets your application to determine that you are in fact a validly registered voter and eligible to vote absentee before they ever send you a ballot. So we're not talking about ballots here. We're just talking about the blank application, which, by the way, is available on the Secretary of State's website. And so again, if it's illegal to solicit a voter into obtaining an absentee ballot application, it's unclear if that applies only to the physical act of handing a person the application or sending them the link to a blank absentee ballot form on the Secretary of State's website or their local election authority's website. Because that language is so unclear, and because it potentially engulfs so much civic engagement activity, the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, along with the ACLU of Missouri and Campaign Legal Center, filed a lawsuit last week on behalf of the Missouri League of Women Voters and the Missouri State Conference of the NAACP, arguing that the voter registration and absentee voting provisions violate fundamental rights of free speech, expression, and association of civic engagement organizations, because it does not define what it says to solicit voter registration, which may now be illegal, in certain circumstances, nor does it tell us what it means to solicit an absentee ballot application, which is a serious criminal offense under this law. That means that a broad range of advocacy, including encouraging people to register and to take the steps they need to get an absentee ballot, might be considered solicitation under this law. We have sought a preliminary injunction asking the court to make a swift ruling on this legal question and asking the court to block those provisions while the case continues through the court process. This lawsuit was brought in Missouri State Court, arguing that these two provisions, the voter registration provisions, these three pieces, and the absentee ballot solicitation restriction violate the Missouri Constitution guarantee of free expression and freedom of association. And here are just a couple of newspaper articles that came out announcing that lawsuit. And there's some really strong, there are some strong comments in there by the League of Women Voters, by the Missouri State Conference of the NAACP, expressing concern about the breadth of the ways that the voter registration provisions and the absentee ballot solicitation ban could really potentially stifle a lot of civic engagement activity in the state of Missouri, because we simply don't know how broadly it could be perceived. Indeed, the ban on soliciting absentee ballot applications could potentially be so broad as to even prohibit the encouragement of exercising the law's new no excuse absentee voting provisions, which will allow voters in the final 2 weeks before Election Day to cast a no excuse absentee ballot in person at their local election authority if they have a valid, non-expired Missouri or federal ID. Here's another clip from the Kansas City Star. And I really want to thank not just the League of Women Voters and the NAACP, but especially the League of Women Voters and the NAACP for stepping up to challenge these restrictions. But the truth of the matter is, they're speaking out for so many of you and so many of the organizations that we've heard from concerned about whether and how they can continue to do voter registration and help the neediest of Missouri voters get a ballot that they need to cast. And here's what I'm here to tell you today. You can still do voter registration in Missouri, even under these restrictions. So while this law is very vague and we need to be careful right now, because it potentially encompasses so much civic engagement work, we're going to offer some tips here today and some possible recommendations of ways you can still participate, but still be in compliance with this law. You can still do voter registration. But keep in mind, here are some rules. Number one, unless you work for a government agency, you cannot be compensated for doing voter registration. Do not get paid and do not pay others. And again, because the law does not define what it means to compensate someone for voter registration, we encourage you not to compensate your volunteers with reimbursements or gifts or treats or snacks, but instead urge them to bring their own snacks with them when they come to volunteer for voter registration. Second, be sure you register as a voter registration solicitor with the Missouri Secretary of State's office. Again, make sure that you are 18 and a Missouri registered voter. and ensure that the other individuals in your organization who want to do voter registration are registered voters in Missouri, and instruct people who are not registered voters in Missouri that there's many other things they can do, but that they should not do voter registration. You will have to sign the form and get that form back to the Secretary of State's office, after which you will get an acknowledgement that your solicitation application has been received. So here's some recommendations for things you can do. You don't need to cancel your voter registration drives, but we do understand that this measure has generated fear and concern and is leading many groups to significantly stifle their voter registration activities, since violating these rules is a criminal offense. So here's some things you can do to help your volunteers be in compliance. First, if you are an organization that does any voter registration, don't wait until right before that voter registration drive. Send all of your volunteers that solicitation form and encourage everyone to register as a voter registration solicitor with the Missouri Secretary of State's office. It will cover you all the way through the entire 2022 election cycle. One thing that you can do to help facilitate this, especially for people that may not have ready access to a computer, the solicitation requirement can be burdensome because you're going to need access to the internet. You're going to need a computer. You're going to need to be able to print the form because it needs to be signed. And you're going to need a way to get it back to the Secretary of State's office, either by faxing it, by scanning that form with your signature and emailing it back, or by putting it in the United States mail and mailing it to the Secretary of State's office. If you are an organization that wants to do voter registration, you can help facilitate this process for your volunteers by printing a stack of the solicitation forms. And next time your volunteers come in to help with a phone bank, or if you're having a general membership meeting, have everyone fill out that form and offer to scan and email them back or fax them back for your volunteers. In addition, in order to ensure that you are on the safe side of this law, if you are organizing a voter registration drive, we recommend, and again, none of this is legal advice because we just don't know the scope of this law, but these are some recommendations you can do. We recommend that you have your volunteers confirm that they did in fact receive a confirmation email from the Secretary of State's office of their solicitation form. And if you really want to be careful about it, you can adopt a formal policy making this clear so that your volunteers know these rules and know what they need to do to stay on the right side of the law. And that's going to help dispel some of the misinformation, help dispel some of the confusion, and also help dispel some of the intimidation factor that this law puts into place. People don't want to volunteer if it puts them at risk of a criminal penalty or being arrested or being prosecuted. Here is a sample policy. You do not need to adopt this exact language. It's just one way that your organization can try to ease the minds of your voter registration volunteers. I want to give a shout out to the League of Women Voters of Missouri that has already formally adopted a policy very similar to this. And it can be as simple as this. It's the policy of my organization that all those who participate in voter registration activities must receive a confirmation from the Secretary of State's office of the solicitor's registration for that election cycle, be at least 18 years old, and be a registered voter in the state of Missouri. And this policy is in response to House Bill 1878 and will remain in force until revoked by your board. And again, it doesn't have to follow this language exactly. This is just one example But it's one thing that groups that rely upon voter registration, for which voter registration is their core work, like the League of Women Voters, felt the need to provide this guidance to their members and also this reassurance that will help them feel better about signing up to do voter registration. Here is the new form that you will have to complete. You can find it online at sos.mo.gov/elections. You will need to print your name. You can type out these pieces online, but you cannot submit this form online. So you will need to include your name, your residential address, your mailing address, your phone number, your email address, and optionally, the name of the organization that you are doing voter registration with. Most importantly, you have to sign it with a pen and date it. And that will require you to print this form out. At the bottom of the form, you will see a mailing address, an email address, and a fax number where you can return these forms. And again, groups and organizations, if you want to help your volunteers, you can get a stack and help get them in to the Secretary of State's office for your volunteers. And in fact, some organizations are really making an event out of this activity. While we understand these new rules are intimidating, we're here to help make sure that voter registration continues, because we've got one more month to do voter registration before the October 12th voter registration deadline. So next week, just as an example, the League of Women Voters is taking a big stack of completed voter registration solicitation forms and are going to hand them in person at the Secretary of State's office next Wednesday, September 7th at 1:30 p.m. at 600 Main Street in Jefferson City, and they invite you to join them. Let's see how many groups can get people registered as voter registration solicitors and show up and say, we will not be deterred. While this may be burdensome, and it is, it's burdensome for groups. It's burdensome for volunteers to have to do this. And it really excludes people that don't have access to the internet or a printer or a scanner or a fax machine, or people who maybe can't confirm that they can volunteer for voter registration until the last minute. It's very burdensome, but let's show them that we will carry on. We will carry on in spite of these burdens. It doesn't mean these burdens don't exist, and they are very burdensome and unconstitutionally burdensome to require people to go through this and to ban organizations from advocating and soliciting voter registration and soliciting absentee ballots. But we're going to go forward because we have to, because elections are just too important. And the people who stand to be left out are the people that otherwise wouldn't get voter registration except through a voter registration drive. They're people that wouldn't have access to the tools of democracy, but for the work and the civic engagement work and the outreach that all of you do. And let's show up in force on September 20th for National Voter Registration Day. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is coordinating efforts across the state of Missouri. Commit to have your group make a stand on National Voter Registration Day on September 20th. Just make sure you are doing it in compliance with these rules. The last piece of our presentation, and we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. So we just covered the voter registration restrictions and the absentee ballot solicitation bans. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the voter ID restrictions in House Bill 1878. Many of you know that Missouri lawmakers have been attempting to enshrine restrictive voter ID requirements to vote in Missouri for well over 15 years. And at least several times they succeeded in passing such a law. But in both instances, the Missouri Supreme Court concluded that limiting, unduly restricting the forms of ID to the kind that you have to get at the DMV violates Missouri's constitutional right to vote and to equal protection. This new law continues down the same path that they have already gone down before. Whoops. Under this provision, the new law that went into effect eliminates what were previously called Option 2 IDs, those non-photo forms of ID that many Missourians use to identify their identity at the polls, and requires only non-expired Missouri or federal photo ID to vote. The measure also eliminates the Secretary of State's obligation to provide advance notice of these new rules and eliminates dedicated funding for him to do so. Here's a pictorial of, in essence, what House Bill 1878 has done. And I like to refer to it this way because Missouri was already a voter ID state before this law went into effect. All voters already had to show ID. But as you see on this picture, voters could show many different forms of ID, such as a voter registration card or a student ID. Both of those have now been eliminated, as have other government documents that contain your name and current address. And so many voters rely on these forms of ID. The voter registration card is a very helpful document. It's verification from the election authority that you're validly registered to vote in that upcoming election. It tells you where your polling place is. It tells you what precinct you're in. For many students in Missouri, especially where they go to school with a polling place on campus, they rely on, many may not drive if they live on campus, they rely on that student ID for everything, including voting in Missouri. And we know that when young people register and vote, they are more committed to the communities that they are living and going to school in, and are much more likely to stay and contribute their talents and skills in those communities. What is left after eliminating those other forms of ID is a non-expired Missouri or federal ID, typically the kind that you have to get at the DMV. Now, it's important to note that if you don't have one of those forms of ID, you can cast a provisional ballot, but that's not a regular ballot. Your ballot is put in provisional status, and it won't get counted until after Election Day, only if you return to the polling place with a valid photo ID, or if the signature on the provisional ballot envelope matches the signature that the election authority has on file with your voter registration. And so here's the new poster that the Secretary of State's office. Here's the old poster. Here's the new poster that just came out this week. And under this measure, you must show a non-expired Missouri driver or non-driver license, a non-expired military or veterans ID card, a non-expired United States passport, or other similar state or federal ID. If you don't present one of those forms of photographic ID, so now you cannot show an ID from another state anymore, or a student ID, even though it has a picture on it, or a voter registration card, you will be relegated to casting a provisional ballot. And again, that ballot will only count if you come back to the polling place with a photo ID or if your signature matches. Unfortunately, the law does not provide any guidance for what constitutes a signature match. And there are 116 local election authorities and their staffs are not trained on hand matching, signature matching analysis. In addition, for many people, especially our seniors and voters with disabilities, their signatures may change over time. In addition, there are other reasons that provisional ballot may not count. You can see there's a form you have to fill out if you cast a provisional ballot. If it is not filled out completely, it may not be counted. If the voter does not sign the outer envelope, it will not be counted. And if two poll workers, one from each political party, don't also sign that document, it will not be counted. And if you did not cast it in the correct polling place, it will not be counted. And so again, it is a provisional ballot that can be counted, but it is not guaranteed that it will be counted. And there are many reasons it may not be counted. And this was the subject of great critique and controversy in the Missouri legislature, with a number of legislators speaking up about the disparate impact that this provision would have, particularly on communities of color, low-income communities, voters with disabilities, our seniors, young voters, students, English plus communities, gender nonconforming communities whose photographic IDs may not match their presentation. And in fact, there are quite a few Missourians who don't have a non-expired Missouri ID on file with the Missouri Department of Revenue. This is from an analysis that the Secretary of State undertook several years ago, the last time they tried to do this. And it found that over 137,000 registered voters in Missouri did not have any ID on file with the Missouri Department of Revenue, like a driver's license or non-driver's license. 140,000 had expired IDs. Those will have to be renewed. And if they were expired more than a year and a half, 2 years ago, you will have to start the process anew. And several thousand had their IDs forfeited. So that's a lot of voters. It's approximately 6% of Missouri's registered voters, approximately 10% of the population. And the Missouri Supreme Court has previously concluded that this kind of requirement does violate Missourians' right to vote, in part because of the burdens of getting a state ID if you don't have one, or if it's been expired for some time. It can cost money to get an ID. It can cost money to get the underlying documents. And many times you have to present various forms of identification to get the underlying documents necessary to get an ID. In order to get a state ID in Missouri, you will need to present, and it can be to get a non-driver's license, and this is a non-real ID either. You have to present proof of identity, like a certified birth certificate or naturalization papers. You have to present proof of lawful status. You have to present proof of your social security number, like an original social security card or tax records. And you have to present proof of your Missouri residency, like a current utility bill or voter registration card. And the hurdles to getting those underlying documents can be significant, especially if you have to get those documents from out of state. If you were born in another state and you need to get that birth certificate from another state, if you need to get naturalization papers, those can be very pricey. And a number of states require you to present a photo ID to get a copy of your birth certificate, which is necessary to get a photo ID. Other voters may have barriers even to getting to motor vehicles offices if they lack transportation, if they work low-wage jobs and can't get off work. Many are not open evenings or weekends. People who don't have permanent addresses returning citizens, people who are in shelters. And those are the reasons that following on the Missouri Supreme Court's determination that this violates the right to vote, we filed a second lawsuit last week on behalf of the Missouri NAACP and Missouri League of Women Voters, arguing that this newest version of the voter ID law also violates the fundamental right to vote. And I do need to say that the law does require the state to provide one ID to Missourians who don't already have one without cost, and that's going to be a non-driver's license. It can't be the driver's license. And if you already have one, but you lost it or it's expired, they will not provide you another one without cost. They will also assist you in getting underlying documents like that birth certificate or social security card. But that can be very difficult, especially if there are errors on those underlying documents, or if they don't exist. For example, if you were born at home, or if they were destroyed, if your documents may have been destroyed in floods, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes. I've had clients that have been in all of those situations. But there are things you can do. Help us identify voters who are facing barriers to getting an ID. Help send a letter to the editor about any of the aspects of this law to your local newspaper. We have communications professionals who will help you draft, edit the letter, and get it placed. It helps. It helps for people to see how folks are impacted by voting laws. And you can help people get needed IDs. We are working with our partners who have set up photo ID clinics. And we have partners that are willing to train your group on how to set up a photo ID clinic to help people get the underlying documents that they need. In St. Louis, the next clinic is taking place Saturday, September 10th, 10 to 2 at the Hub. And you can call 314-252-8060 for more information. Help us tell their stories in court. The only way we're going to win this case is if we can really show how people are burdened. And many people don't realize that many folks have barriers to getting a state ID. They've lost it, they lack access to transportation, they may never have gotten a birth certificate, people without permanent addresses. Help us tell their stories, help us connect with these individuals. And finally, the one really important thing you can do if you do none of these other things, sign up to volunteer for election protection this November. If history tells us anything, it's that putting new rules in place midway through an election cycle is bound to create confusion for both voters and poll workers alike. We ask you to join our nonpartisan election protection program that includes placing monitors at polling places throughout the state, like these folks. You may recognize a few faces here, who are a friendly face, who will have information available about what the rules are and help explain them to voters, help voters advocate for their rights. You can sign up. We don't have the polling place shift sign up ready yet. It's still only just September 1st, but you can sign up to get on the list where you will get further information about upcoming election protection trainings at protectthevote.net. And we're going to need all hands on deck to help make sure that voters feel confident exercising their right to vote. Your presence at the polls can help give them that confidence. And I want to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank the Sierra Club, the League of Women Voters of Missouri, for sponsoring this really critical event. Don't hesitate to reach out to the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. There's my email address and phone number, and we are happy to take your questions in the remaining time we have left.
Yeah, Anne is going to facilitate some questions. I know we have the time until 8 o'clock, but all of us facilitators have agreed to stay later to answer all the questions because there are so many. So I'm going to pass it over to Anne, and thanks Denise for that wonderful breakdown.
Yep, thank you, Denise. For our first question, we'd like to know, does someone need to wait until they get some kind of confirmation before they start registering voters?
The statute itself doesn't answer that question, but it does say that any person who expects to register 10 or more voters needs to register with the Secretary of State as a solicitor. Our recommendation is that you do that prior to undertaking any voter registration activities. You can do it now, and your registration will carry you through the entire election cycle. If you think you may do any voter registration this year, get it off your plate, get it done.
And when does that election cycle end? What's the last date for this election cycle?
This will carry you through the full 2022 election cycle. Election cycles are typically 2-year periods.
So
You will
until
have to re-register again after this. But at
And-
that point,
and-
yes, so this will carry you through the November elections, through the 2022 election cycle.
Okay, and there's lots of questions about what exactly it means to solicit voter registration. So is it safe for an organization to put information on their social media, or to have a sign with a QR code, or any other signage like that?
Yeah. So again, we don't recommend that because we don't know. The statute does not define what constitutes soliciting voter registration. We know that in some other states that have had similar laws being challenged. By the way, this solicitation mandate is one of the most strict in the country. Several other states have put similar laws into place, and some of those laws have been struck down. The dictionary defines solicitation as encouragement, urging people to do something, asking them to do something. But again, the statute doesn't say. So it could. This law will be enforced by each of Missouri's 115 local prosecuting attorneys. It's up to them to decide if they believe a provision of Missouri law has been violated and to determine whether they will prosecute it. Because the statute doesn't answer those questions, solicitation could be read quite broadly. That's one reason we are arguing it is unconstitutional. So solicitation could be read as broadly as encouraging someone to register to vote, as putting a sign up on social media saying register to vote. We just don't know.
And if a member of an organization violates this law, then what kind of jeopardy does that put the organization in?
Yeah, so again, prosecutorial decisions are handled by each of Missouri's 115 prosecuting attorneys. And prosecutors have very broad discretion to decide when to charge people with crimes, what crimes to charge them with based on the evidence they have, and whether or not to pursue a conviction or settle or offer a plea bargain. But again, the voter registration provisions are both a class 3 and class 4 election offenses. Those are misdemeanor offenses. The ban on soliciting an absentee ballot application is a class 1 election offense. It is potentially a felony that carries possible penalties of fines, jail time, and possible loss of voting rights for the rest of your life. Again, it will be up to local prosecutors in each of the 115 jurisdictions to determine when they are going to prosecute this, because that could lead to really arbitrary enforcement and application. Again, it's one of the reasons we are arguing in court that this law is unconstitutionally vague, because it doesn't give people clear guidance on what activity is prohibited.
Would an intern who works for a government employee be considered a government employee as well, or would they be banned from registering voters?
So remember, Government employees are absolutely allowed to register voters. What the law provides is that no one shall be, and also non-governmental entities can do voter registration. Everyone can do voter registration. What the law says is that no one shall be paid or otherwise compensated for doing voter registration except for a governmental entity. So people who work at governmental entities can be paid or compensated for the work they do doing voter registration. Nobody else can be paid to do voter registration, but can continue to do voter registration as long as they register with the Secretary of State as a solicitor and are over the age of 18 and are a registered voter in Missouri.
And if we have people students from out of state ask about absentee voting in their home state, are we allowed to discuss that?
The law does not define what constitutes soliciting an absentee ballot application. And again, the dictionary defines solicitation quite broadly as encouragement or urging. Again, we don't know how broadly this could be interpreted. It's one of the reasons we are arguing that this law is unconstitutionally vague, because it doesn't give clear guidance on what activity constitutes soliciting a voter, an absentee ballot application. So that's what I can tell you. We cannot give you legal guidance or legal advice here because the law is not clear. What we encourage is what we have suggested on this webinar tonight, to make those voter registration solicitor forms available, to not undertake activity that might be deemed soliciting an absentee ballot application. If someone asked me, I would probably tell them to check their own state's Secretary of State's website at this moment. I
Okay,
understand these frustrations. This is very frustrating, and you can see now, even just by the way these questions are being asked, the ways that you can start to see how this measure potentially really limits the ability of civic engagement organizations to advocate for practices and policies like registering to vote and participating in the voting process.
will this have an effect on what kind of grants organizations can apply for and receive?
Well, potentially it could have an effect on grants, because the House Bill 1878 provides that no one shall be paid or otherwise compensated for soliciting voter registration outside of a governmental entity. So grants doesn't necessarily say where the payment or compensation comes from. It's not defined. So grants could, it certainly, if grants are being used to pay staff or pay interns, or pay people to undertake voter registration, that could certainly be considered possibly problematic under that provision.
Are there any changes to the permanent disability absentee ballot option?
No, and that's another good option. I should have probably mentioned that people who in Missouri who are confined due to illness or disability can get on the permanent absentee voter list. And you can obtain a form to do so on your local election authority's website. You do not need to provide any medical documentation, and you don't need to provide an explanation of the nature of your illness or disability. You simply need to assert that you're confined. And so it's very valuable for many seniors or elderly folks. My mother is now on the permanent absentee voter list because she doesn't get around. She doesn't have a chronic illness, but she is in a wheelchair and she can't walk very well, and she can't drive, she can't get to the election office. If you're on the permanent absentee voter list, you will automatically get an absentee ballot application in the mail every election cycle. You don't have to vote by absentee every election cycle, but your election authority will automatically mail you the application to do so. That is a good solution for many people who may be in situations where they are largely confined based on age, illness, disability, that would otherwise make it difficult for them to regularly get to the polls.
Can an out-of-state college student get a Missouri ID in addition to their home state ID?
No, they cannot. You can only have one state ID. So if you are, if you've got a driver's license from another state, you would have to forfeit it to get a Missouri driver or non-driver license.
Has the composition of the court, the state Supreme Court, I assume, changed since the last lawsuit?
Yeah, but you know, the court was very clear, not just in 2006, but also more recently in 2020, when they looked at another aspect of the prior version of Missouri's voter ID law. And they considered whether or not a request from the state to eliminate those non-photo forms of ID. And the court concluded in that case, it was called Priorities USA versus Missouri in 2020, that doing so would raise the same constitutional problems. Because this law similarly eliminates those non-photo forms of ID, does not allow those voters to cast a regular ballot, it similarly poses the same constitutional problems.
Okay, and I think the last question is, have these laws then have been challenged in other states, and what have the outcomes been?
Yes, they have. And I think this is actually a nice sort of kind of concluding thing to land on, because it's important to remember that this law here in Missouri it didn't come about organically. It didn't come about because of issues or problems in Missouri. Our own Secretary of State has confirmed that Missouri's elections are safe and secure. In fact, he even said that Missouri's elections in the 2020 cycle that was rife with all sorts of challenges due to the COVID pandemic and disinformation and new voting laws that allowed people to vote by mail were the most safe and secure in Missouri's history. The truth of the matter is that House Bill 1878 mirrors legislation that has been introduced around the country in 49 out of the 50 states since the 2020 election cycle, designed to target practices that made voting more accessible, particularly for underserved communities during the 2020 election cycle. And so that's why you're seeing not only limits on being able to get absentee ballots through the mail, which really harm those seniors and people with disabilities and low-wage workers and other disadvantaged communities, but also criminalizing the activities of the civic engagement organizations that work so hard to ensure those very communities have access to the political process. And so other states have passed restrictions on soliciting voter registrations. Other states have passed bans on providing absentee ballot applications or assisting voters with absentee ballots. Other states have also passed voter identification restrictions and other restrictions on providing assistance to voters, like this law does. Missouri's new law also opens the door to allowing the Secretary of State to remove voters from the voter rolls It opens the door to private firms conducting audits of Missouri elections outside of audit best practices. It bans local election authorities from getting grants to improve their practices, and all of these mere provisions that we've seen around the country. The voter registration absentee assistance bans have been struck down in some other states. In others, the registration restrictions have been upheld. It really depends on how limiting and how strict they are. And here, Missouri's is one of the most strict in the country. And our state constitution ardently protects the constitutional right to freedom of speech, expression, and association, and more strictly protects the right to vote than even our federal constitution does. If we are going to fight back against the assaults that we're seeing around the country, and again, Missouri is just one of part of a nationwide trend, it will fall on all of us as advocates to help make sure our communities know about these rules, to fight them in court where we can. We believe that we have very strong arguments about the unconstitutionality of these provisions, but we also still have to get out there and educate our communities to make sure that they are not intimidated, that they are not deterred, because laws like this also have the effect of causing people to stay home when the rules become too confusing. Let's help make sure that the communities we work with have the tools they need to be able to effectively advocate and fight for their ability to have a say in our democratic process.
Thank you, Denise. There was just one other question that I wanted to make sure we got the answer to, but I think Nancy's going to answer that one, I hope, which is what organizations are looking for volunteers, looking for members that are helping people register to vote?
Well, I think what we might want to do here, I know Denise has said she's willing to answer more questions, but I know some people will want to get off because they just have they have lives. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close this out, and then we'll keep going with Denise as long as she'll put up with us. Okay, so I think in particular, the League of Women Voters is always looking for people to help us register. You do have to be a member of the League to register voters with the League, but many organizations are, and you know, if your inbox isn't full, then I don't know, check your spam. So on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Missouri, I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight to this event, which was put on by primarily Denise, but it was sponsored, I guess, by the Sierra Club and the League of Women Voters of Missouri. As most of you know, the League is a nonpartisan organization which for over 100 years has had the same mission: to help voters vote. HB 1878 is an onerous new law which places many obstacles in the way of accomplishing this mission. Tonight's program was meant to help us understand this law, what we can and cannot legally do. More importantly, it was helpful to understand how we can legally work under the current law and still accomplish our mission. We will have to jump through some hoops, but in the end, we will persist. Let's focus on how we can make sure everyone entitled to vote is able to vote a regular, non-provisional ballot. And I'd like to thank Denise for basically hitting another home run. And I'd also like to recognize the top person in LWV in Missouri, which is our state president, Marilyn McLeod. So if you need to leave, I guess this would be a good time. If you don't, keep your questions coming. Thank you.
And I just want to reiterate, if you want to get more involved and you want to do voter registration, if you want to help voters, if you want to do election protection, if you want to be part of National Voter Registration Day, if you're not otherwise part of a group, that's okay. You can join the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, the League of Women Voters is a member, the Sierra Club's a member, the NAACP is a member, the ACLU is a member. There's groups all across the state of Missouri, large and small. We have campus groups who are members. We have environmental justice groups, women's rights groups, all across the board, disability rights advocates, LGBT rights advocates, whatever your area of interest, get involved. And there is a lane for you in this space. Send us a text at MOVPC to 66866 or email us at info@movpc.org. It's a great way to learn about activities that other organizations are doing where they need volunteers. We send out action alerts with all of our partner organizations' work that's going on and the asks that they have, and you can collaborate with one another and join the efforts that so many groups are already doing. It really does take all of us to do this work. Thanks.
Okay, let me see what other questions we have in the Q&A. One sec. On the solicitor form, someone asked if it would be best to leave the entity optional. Let's see, there's an optional question for the entity that you're soliciting for. Would it be best to go ahead and say what organization you are with, or to leave that blank?
That's up to you. It is optional on the voter registration solicitation form. It says optional. What is not optional is your name, address, mailing address, email, telephone, and importantly, your signature. The organization is optional. It's up to you whether to include it or not.
And we want to make sure and mention that if you sent in your form to the Secretary of State's office prior to midnight or to 10 o'clock, I think the form was updated at about 10 o'clock on Sunday evening. If you sent in a form that you got prior to 10 o'clock on Sunday evening, that is not the correct form. You need to go ahead and re-register with the Secretary of State.
No, not
Is that the
necessarily. It's
case?
good
That's
for,
not the case?
no, it's good for an election cycle. So if you've already registered this election cycle, it will carry you through the November elections this year.
So if you registered with the old form, that is still okay, even if it had the. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
What has changed? Yeah, because under previous law, there were voter registration solicitors. It was just limited to people that were getting paid to do voter registration. Now, everybody who does voter registration has to register as a solicitor.
Okay, I think we've actually answered all the questions that are in Q&A. I haven't been monitoring chat, so I don't know if there's some more questions. Ashton, do you want to let us know?
Yeah, actually, there's just one more question I saw a few times. It's just, I've seen if you have an update about the general timeline of these lawsuits.
That's a good question. We have asked that they be expedited because the elections are coming fast and quick. The voter registration deadline is Wednesday, October 12th. The deadline to request an absentee ballot by mail is Wednesday, October 26th. So we need these to be heard swiftly and promptly. In the voter registration case, we've asked for a preliminary injunction, meaning that we're asking the court to consider putting those provisions, the voter registration and absentee provisions, on hold while they continue to litigate the case. In the voter ID case, we've asked for an expedited hearing because that case will require some fact witnesses to demonstrate the burdens.
Wonderful.
Okay, maybe there is one more question in Q&A. Has the state announced a process for people to get help on fees and documents?
Yeah, and this was actually part of the existing law. The state will provide one form of ID. It's a non-driver's license without cost and will assist people that need help getting those underlying documents. That's going to probably work best for people whose underlying documents are here in Missouri. It may be a little bit more difficult, though they will try to help you if your birth certificate or marriage license or divorce decree that you're going to need to get are in other states. It will be challenging if those documents have errors or if they're missing. You would need to contact the Secretary of State's office and speak to their election staff. There's information on the Secretary of State's website at sos.mo.gov. However, as I mentioned in my presentation, we know that that's not going to be sufficient. And it's not going to be sufficient, especially for the people who have the greatest barriers getting the IDs, people that don't have those underlying documents, people that are housing insecure, people that have errors on those underlying documents. That's why our partners have been working to set up the ID clinics ourselves so that we can meet with people in the community who need help in a location that's a trusted location for them. Right. And so I would encourage you to send people to the September 10th photo ID clinic in St. Louis. And I would encourage you to reach out to the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition if you want to get a training on how to run a voter ID clinic yourself.
Great. All right, that's it for the Q&A.
I would just say that the best way to follow along on the lawsuits is to show up on Monday mornings at Denise's and find out what's the latest.
Wonderful. I do know there are some more questions in the chat there that have not been answered because unfortunately with chat versus Q&A, we get them a little mixed up. We are going to save the chat. If we did not answer your question, we will follow up with you. All of this will be recorded, and any links and flyers to events, to anything we mentioned tonight will also be accompanied with this. But thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your time. Thank you to Denise for your infinite fountain of knowledge. We thank you for this space. And everyone have a great evening, and sign up in the link that Denise just put in the chat to keep up to date with this weekly in the process of these lawsuits. But thank you everyone again, and have a great evening.